Welcome to the MAM Journals. Some of you may recall that I did a YouTube video of this particular bike and my initial views on it back in March earlier this year. And in that video I mentioned that I wasn't particularly happy with the rear shock absorber. And I've done 1,700 miles on the bike this year, and although I've changed the rear tyre, I've actually got less confident with the bike despite the extra mileage, and I thought, no, I really do need to deal with it. So by upgrading suspension, my objective is to deal with the issue that I've got, and I'll explain that in a moment, whilst retaining the key characteristics of the bike that make me like it so much in the first place. It's a very easy, middle of the road bike to ride and comfortable without being too sharp on the steering and pretty stable at speeds. So I want to retain that while dealing with the issue. The issue that I've got with it is over certain terrains, the back was stepping out. I thought the tyre changing, as I say, would solve that, but in reality it didn't. And what it does is it was compressing too quickly and coming back too slowly, and I tried to adjust it on the conventional rear shock, but you haven't really got many options in terms of what you do with that. So I've gone for the upgrade. So what we'll be covering is what the original equipment actually does and what I've actually fitted on it, the process of fitting. We won't be going into the absolute minutiae of that, but we're giving you an idea of what's involved in the fitting, the adjustments that you make when you've actually fitted the suspension and you're into the fine tuning. I'm not a great fan in what I call eBay engineering. You can't just buy things from the internet, bolt them on and hope that you'll suddenly be Jonathan Ray. And in terms of ability, it doesn't quite work like that. And it makes sense to invest a bit of your time to make sure you get the best of the investment that you've made in the new suspension. And finally, I'd like to talk about the basics of geometry and setup. I'm very conscious that some of you actually are very experienced in this field, and you may choose to skip this sector, but I'm equally conscious that some of us needed to remind ourselves as to what's actually going on with the bike. So let's go on to that section, the basics of motorcycle geometry. I learned early on in my biking experience that how long a bike was and the angle of the front forks affects how stable it is or how quick it is to turn. This bike is designed to be an all-rounder, and it's got fairly moderate stroke normalised size. It's 57.8 wheel patch to wheel patch contact in terms of its dimensions, and it's got a 25-degree rake or caster, depending on how you're looking at it. Now, to give you an idea of why that's sort of, I've described that as middle of the road, something like a BMW R1200 GS is 59 in terms of length, and it's 27 degrees in terms of angle. So that makes the bike both longer and with a more angled fork degree. So that bike will, by the nature of its geometry and its design, it will be more stable than a bike like this is designed to be, which will be more manoeuvrable. And if we went and looked at the other end of the scale and you went to something like an out-and-out sports bike, my 996R is 55 and 23.5 degrees. Now you might think 1.5 degrees doesn't make any difference, but if you rode the bike for more than a mile, you'd certainly recognise the difference in the speed of the turning of the bike and the nature of its manoeuvrability. So what we're trying to do with this bike is keep its key characteristics whilst adjusting the geometry. Now, what we're actually trying to do is make sure, in order to get the bike to handle well, we want it to be on a level and the front suspension operating the same as the rear suspension. So you don't get it soft at the back, creating a nose upward, or soft at the front with a nose downward, as that will change the geometry and the performance of the bike. So what we really need to understand is the things that we influence to do that. So to set the ride height, it's really about sag, the measurement of the drop that you get in, and preload, the amount of tension that you put on the springs in order to allow the bike to drop or otherwise. Now, some of us, quite naturally, occasionally attempt a primitive adjustment of height by softening the springs, which will make the back go down, but then and actually effectively give us a lower ride height. but it has changed the geometry unless you start making alterations at the front. What some people do is they start dropping the front forks in order to get that effect to be slightly lower. But again, it's probably okay to do that, but you have changed the characteristics of the bike. So what I'd like to do is keep it at the right level, adjust the preload on the springs front and back, adjust the height of the rear through a proper adapter on more adaptive rear shock absorber, and get the sag so that I've got that initial position when I ride it at the right ride height for me while the bike is in a level position. You then go on to tune the fine tuning of the bike in terms of its suspension, which is really rebound and compression. And those are measurements or words to describe what's going on within the units themselves in terms of there's a piston inside the shock, which is being with hydraulic fluid, and that is being compressed. The speed at which it comes down, the compression, is altered by you making adjustments on it, affecting the amount of squash that you're actually getting via that compression. And the rebound is an adjustment on the valving about how quickly that piston will return, and those two adjustments affect the handling of the bike and not the geometry. So that's a basic explanation of what we're going to be doing when we're trying to set this bike up. So this is the standard rear shock on the bike, and the thing that I was perhaps the least convinced was actually operating properly or within the range that I wanted. And although it looks like it's got a lot of adjustment on this thread here, if you look at your bike, it's probably already set towards this end, so you haven't actually got much to play with. Whilst if you look on the new ones that I've fitted, there's much more adjustment either way. You have got basic rebound adjustment on here, but if you actually click this round, one, you'll find there's not that many clicks, so you haven't got actually that much variation in choice. And the second is you might find it's already set quite close to the top end of what you're actually looking for. So although I did play about with those, I couldn't quite get it for me to be offering the sort of handling that I was looking for, which is again what led to me changing my shock absorbers. This is the front cartridge of the bike, and actually in fairness I think these are okay. I didn't have much problem with the front end. I did manage to adjust it. You've got, as you can see on the end there, you've got preload through the smaller black nut, and you've got rebound adjustment with that central screw, and you've also got compression adjustment, which is on the front fork of the leg down on the bottom on the right hand side, and that was okay for me, although I did make the decision, because I'm in a position where I can make those sort of decisions, that I wanted to change them as a complete set. Now other people have adjusted the front, and what they've gone is for either changing the spring, and you can get progressive or linear springs, and that's really about how quickly or how they respond to downward pressure. So in other words, whether a progressive spring would have more give initially, and then later on it would stiffen up, while a linear spring, as the word sort of indicates, it responds equally to the force applied throughout its range. So in other words, it's equal as the bike compresses. Other things you can do is you can clearly change the hydraulic fluid in the front forks and stiffen it up, and a number of people I know have actually done that, and they've had perfectly satisfactory results, and I think that's a perfectly logical solution if you don't want to go to the expense of actually changing the front cartridges as well. I chose to, but speaking honestly, I don't think you necessarily need to unless you particularly want to. Okay, so as you can see, what I've chosen to go for is the nitrons, and I didn't choose them because they're the only good shocks available. There's plenty of other options. I know the K-Tech make a good set of shocks, and also obviously Olen's are well-established brands. I chose to go for the nitrons because one, I know a dealer who could help me with the fitting of them, and two, the company itself is quite local to me here, and I wanted to support them if I could, and I'd heard very good reports. I personally, I love the quality of the way they're put together. They're a fantastic piece of engineering, which I always enjoy. And I particularly liked the fact that I could get it in a fairly muted colour that didn't look too different from the original. Because for me, I'm very happy that I've changed it, but I don't particularly need to advertise that through a brightly coloured identifying spring. Although some people do that, and if it makes them happy, then I'll be the last person to complain about it. So I've chosen those. They cost me about, let's call it £1,400, just to give you an idea of what they cost. And what I particularly liked about them was the level of adjustment that you actually get on it. In the front, you get two cartridges to put in, and one of the fork cartridges enables you to adjust the rebound, and the other one enables you to adjust the compression. They operate as a single unit, so although it might seem slightly alien to do it that way, you can actually adjust them independently of one another. You haven't got to do the adjustment in a line, and you retain the ability to adjust the preload, i.e. the amount of pressure on the spring, for that initial sag adjustment, which is so important in terms of setting ride height. At the rear unit is a nice unit, and it enables you on above and beyond just the simple rebound adjustment and the preload. You've now got some compression adjustment, albeit through the one same switch. You've also, most importantly for me, you've got the ability to change the length of the shock, which enables you to set ride height without clumsily attempting to do it via the adjustment of the preload. So I like that adjustment. I like the mechanical feel of it and the precision of it, and we managed to get a setup that actually was about right for me, and we adjusted from that point in. When we got to the fitting of the cartridges in the front and the rear shock, I did actually contemplate for a short while, well, I'll do it myself, but actually reading the advice from Nitron, they made it pretty clear that actually, whilst the rear is straightforward, it's only a few bolts, putting in new cartridges was a fairly complicated process, and you really needed to make sure you had the competence, the confidence, and the tools to do the job. And although I've accumulated a fair array of tools over the years, it's not something that I've done on a regular basis, and therefore I took the decision that I would actually ask for some professional help by somebody who does it on a regular basis. And I'm glad that I took the decision, because it's not as straightforward as some might suggest it is, in terms of getting the forks out, getting the existing original equipment out of the forks, inserting the new internals, and then adjusting them up appropriately, filling them with the right amount of oil, and making sure the bike was set up appropriately. So we went through that process. It took about 3 hours, and one of the things you should factor into your thinking, if you're thinking, well, shall I have a go or should I not, is really the importance of getting the bike properly mounted and securely mounted without any front forks in it. If the bike topples over, and you'll certainly do significantly more damage than the 150 odd pounds it's probably going to cost you for labour to do it. So I on balance would, unless you are a very experienced mechanic in terms of working on bikes, my initial advice would be to get somebody to help you do it, and then you can have the fun of doing the fine tuning. When we initially set up the bike, and we put the factory settings that Nitron give you in terms of the ride height and the sag, and I have to say it wasn't right for me right from that initial point. It was too high, so we had to adjust the length of the rear shock to get that back to a level where I felt comfortable. I'm 5'8", I like my feet on the ground, and we had to adjust that down. And then in order to compensate for the fact that we'd lowered the back away from the factory settings, we actually had to adjust the front forks slightly in order to get it to be that level position that is really the ultimate objective. The original settings in terms of the push through on the forks is 8mm. We increased that by 2mm to 10, and that clearly has affected the geometry, going back to my earlier comments on the basics of geometry, but not in a way that fundamentally has changed it. I'm pretty comfortable that it's within a range that I'm comfortable with. So once we got it set up at the height, as I say, it was very obvious to me it was very sportily based, quite firm suspension, and I then had to go off and do my own experiments in terms of how do you adjust it. So how do you adjust these the units? Well, the first thing is they give you a tool which you can adjust the front rebound and compression, and you can just pop that in your pocket and go with you. And the rear of the shock unit is very easy to adjust simply with this gnarled knob, and it's very audible in terms of the connection, so you can't go far wrong. You'll know when you've moved up and down. So I took the bike out, and I was given two bits of very sound advice actually in terms of setting it up. The first thing is Craig, who actually fitted it from King's Two-Wheel Centre in Oxford, and his advice was, well, remember the factory settings, don't twiddle with too much, too often, and too far. So I thought that was very sound advice, because you can be tempted in just as little wild swings, but you actually get more from driving it on or riding it on roads that you know, and just doing gentle adjustments and then comparing it with your experience over the same road surfaces and at the same sort of speeds. And the other bit of advice I got was from a friend of mine who actually raced cars at a very high level professionally for many, many years. And we were just chatting, and he said, yeah, well, if you're going to do that, my advice would be take your time, enjoy it, do it gently, and do not worry about what anyone else tells you are the right settings. The right settings are the ones that feel right for you. And I think that's good advice, because it is about adapting the bike to suit your personal style. And we are all very different in terms of what we're looking for in terms of bike's handling. Right, so what was my conclusions and thoughts having put the suspension on, and did I manage to deal with that problem that I identified at the first? I've got to be honest and say that the first 48 hours I thought, I've made a terrible mistake here. I've spent £1,400 and I've made it worse. I've actually not got a bike that I can ride as easily as I did the one before I put the suspension on, and I'm not convinced I've actually solved the problem. So it did take me a little while to actually get it, but once we'd actually got the height sorted, the sag sorted, and then I began to fine tune it, I got a bit more encouraged and got it to the stage where I could ride roads where I previously had the bike step out, and I was getting quite a lot more confident with it, and it was holding its position. But I hadn't taken away from what I really like about the bike. It's just a bike you can get on and you can ride comfortably. It's not extreme in any shape or form. It's nicely stable, turns nicely into corners, and we actually got there. So what do I think about it now? Well, I've always liked this bike, and I think by putting that new set of suspension on it, I've made a good bike even better. Anyway, I hope you found this useful and you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed it, please press like. As I say, it's good to get some feedback. And if you've not watched one before and you found it interesting, then please press subscribe. But in the meanwhile, ride safe, stay well.